What would you do if you lay awake at 2 in the morning, listening to your wife on the phone in the next room, calmly describing the life she intended to have without you, dividing what you had built together like a woman reading out a shopping list, and you felt no shock at all, because you had seen it coming 11 months ago and had spent every quiet hour since making certain that when she finally moved, you would already be standing somewhere she could not reach. She was on the phone in the next room. She thought he was asleep. He had not slept properly in weeks. And what she did not know, what she had never once considered possible, was that the mild, unremarkable man she had spent 2 years quietly writing out of his own life had understood the whole shape of it before she had finished drawing it, and had built in silence an exit she would never see until she was standing on the wrong side of it. This is a story of hidden worth, of a man everyone had decided was harmless, and of the quiet, devastating patience of someone who saw the disaster coming and simply prepared. Owen Marsden had spent his entire life being underestimated by people who mistook calm for weakness. He was 41, soft-spoken and unremarkable in a room, a man who wore the same 3 jackets and did not interrupt, and had never in his adult life raised his voice, and the world had long ago filed him under harmless. He was an actuary by training, which meant that for 20 years his entire profession had consisted of one thing, which was calculating with cold precision the probability that something would go wrong. He had built a small firm around it, with a partner named Grant Whitlock, a loud, charming, backslapping man who brought in the clients, while Owen did the work that kept them, and everyone who met the two of them assumed, immediately and permanently, that Grant was the business and Owen was the accountant in the back. He had been married for 9 years to Vivian, who had once looked at him with something like admiration, and had, at some point he could not name, started introducing him at parties as her husband, and then changing the subject. What none of them ever understood, not his partner, and not his wife, and not one of the people who talked past him at their own dinner table, was what Owen Marsden actually did for a living. Because Owen did not calculate numbers. He calculated failure, he built models of how things collapse, and he was extraordinary at it. The kind of extraordinary that made insurers quietly pay him a great deal to tell them what they did not want to hear. He could look at a structure, a company, a portfolio, a marriage, and see the load-bearing assumptions inside it and know precisely which one would go first and roughly when. He did not do this because he was cynical. He did it because it was simply how his mind worked, an inability to look at anything without seeing the failure modes, and he had spent 20 years being right about disasters that other people did not believe in until they arrived. And 11 months before the night, he lay awake listening through a wall. Owen Marsden had run the numbers on his own life, and had not liked the answer at all. It had started with nothing. That was the thing about failure. It always started with nothing, a small anomaly that a normal person dismisses, a withdrawal from the business account for a client dinner on a night Owen knew there had been no client. Vivian's phone turning face down on the counter when it had never once needed to before. Grant becoming suddenly effusively generous about Owen taking Fridays off. Any one of them was noise. He looked at all of them together, the way he looked at everything, and he felt the particular cold that came over him when a model started resolving, and he did the only thing he knew how to do. He began, very quietly, to gather data. He said nothing. Not to Vivian, not to Grant, not to a lawyer, not to a friend. He simply started keeping records, and he did it the way an actuary does, which is to say completely and without emotion and with timestamps. 11 months of it. And somewhere in the 4th month, when the pattern had resolved into something unmistakable, Owen Marsden had sat alone in his study at midnight and understood 2 separate facts that most men would have found unbearable, which were that his wife was leaving, and that she was not leaving alone, and that the man she was leaving with was the man who owned half his company. Most men would have broken. Owen ran the model. If he confronted them, he calculated they would deny it, close ranks, and accelerate, and he would lose access to the very information he needed. If he raged, he would look unstable, and unstable men lose custody of everything, including their reputations. And if he did nothing visible at all, and simply prepared, they would proceed at their own pace, confident and unhurried, and would walk directly into a structure he had built in advance. It was not vengeance. He would say that later to the one person who ever really asked, and it was true. It was the only rational response available to a man who could see the collapse coming and could not stop it. So he stopped trying to stop it. And he started building somewhere to stand. In the 9th month, Owen Marsden did something that would matter more than anything else he did, which was that he was noticed. Helena Straub was the reason rooms had temperatures. She was 71, small, silver, and terrifying, the founder of the largest insurance group on that coast, a woman who had built an empire out of other people's catastrophes, and who was known, universally and not affectionately, as the coldest interview in the industry. She did not make small talk. She had ended careers in single sentences. And she had come personally to a routine risk review that Owen's firm was conducting for one of her subsidiaries because she had noticed something in a report and wanted to see who had written it. Grant met her at the door and talked for 19 minutes. Helena Straub listened to him with the expression of a woman reading a menu in a language she did not intend to order from. Then she turned to the quiet man who had not said anything and asked him one question about the report, and Owen answered it. And then she asked him a harder one, and he answered that too. And then she asked him the question she had actually come to ask, which was what he thought her group's real exposure was. And Owen Marsden told her the truth, which nobody ever did. He told her that her third largest subsidiary was carrying a risk she had been assured did not exist, that the assurance was constructed on an assumption he could show her was false, and that on his numbers she had somewhere between 14 and 20 months. The room went silent. Grant laughed and started to apologize for him, and Helena Straub raised one hand without looking away from Owen and said, "Be quiet." Then she looked at the mild, unremarkable man in the same jacket he had worn for 4 years and said, "How long have you known that?" 4 months, said Owen. "And who have you told?" "Nobody," said Owen. "Nobody has asked." And Helena Straub, who had spent 50 years surrounded by men who told her what she wanted to hear, looked at the one man in the building who had told her what she did not, and something happened behind her eyes. She began, from that day, to call him directly, not the firm. Him. She sent him problems that had defeated better paid people, and he solved them, quietly, in the evenings, in the study, where he was also, night after night, assembling 11 months of time-stamped records about his own life. And Helena, who missed nothing, noticed the second thing about him too, which was that he was a man carrying something heavy with absolute composure. She never asked. She simply began, in the way of a woman who had built an empire and buried a husband and had no patience left for pretense, to talk to him like a person. And Owen Marsden, who had not been talked to like a person in years, found that the most feared woman in his industry was the only human being on earth who currently saw him. He had no idea that she was at that moment quietly restructuring her entire consulting relationship around him, and that the timing of it would turn out to be the most consequential thing that had ever happened to him. The humiliation came at a dinner party, and it arrived wearing a great deal of charm. It was at their own house, which was somehow the worst part. Vivienne had invited 11 people, including Grant, and including her closest friend, Corinne, and Owen had cooked because he always cooked, and had spent the evening moving between the kitchen and the table, refilling things that people did not thank him for. And somewhere after the second bottle, the conversation had turned to a story about a colleague who had left his job to start something new, and Corinne had said brightly to the whole table, "Oh God, can you imagine Owen doing something like that?" and laughed. Vivienne laughed too. That was the detail he would remember. She did not defend him, and she did not change the subject. She laughed, and then she said with the terrible fondness people use when they are being cruel in public, "Do not be ridiculous. Owen has never taken a risk in his life. He is the human equivalent of a savings account." And the table laughed, and Grant laughed loudest, and Owen Marsden stood in his own dining room holding a bottle of wine, and understood, with the precision of a man who calculates failure, that his wife had just told 11 people who he was, and that every one of them had believed her. Had the faintest idea what was sitting in the locked drawer of his study. He refilled Karin's glass. He said mildly that she was probably right. And he went back into the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment with his hands on the cold edge of it, and then he finished the washing up. It was, he thought later, the exact moment he stopped grieving. And it was also, though nobody at that table could have known it, the last dinner party Vivienne Marsden would ever host in that house. What Owen had actually been doing for 11 months would have astonished every person who laughed at that table, and it was this: he had assumed from the beginning that the goal was not simply to leave him. Grant was a partner in a firm whose real value, as Owen alone understood, was not the client list Grant had brought in, but the proprietary risk models Owen had spent 15 years building. And Vivienne was a woman who had spent 9 years married to a man she considered a savings account. And a savings account is not a person, it is a balance. Owen had modeled what they would need to do, and it was not complicated. They would need the models to remain firm property so that Grant could take them in a partnership dissolution. They would need Owen distracted, discredited, or slow. And they would need him to have no clients of his own, which was why Grant had been so warmly insistent for 2 years that Owen should stay out of client relationships and focus on the technical work he was so good at. So Owen had done 3 quiet things. First, he had gone back to the original partnership agreement and found in a clause Grant had never read, because Grant did not read, that intellectual property developed outside firm hours on personal equipment remained with its creator. And then he had spent 11 months rebuilding his own core models from scratch at home, at night, on his own machine, documented and time-stamped and witnessed, so that the versions the firm owned were 18 months out of date, and the versions that actually worked were his. Second, he had made copies of everything. Every transfer, every falsified expense, every discrepancy in the accounts that he had been quietly noticing for nearly a year, and had lodged them, sealed, with an attorney he had never mentioned to anyone. And third, in the last 2 months, when Helena Straub had begun calling him directly, he had not routed a single one of those conversations through the firm. Not one. It was not deception. He had simply never been asked to. And that was where matters stood on the night he lay awake at 2 a.m. and listened to his wife, in the next room, tell someone that the timing was fine, that Grant would move in the spring, that the house would have to be sold, obviously, but that Owen would not fight it, because Owen never fights anything. She thought he was asleep. He lay in the dark with his eyes open and felt, to his own surprise, almost nothing at all, because grief arrives when a thing is lost, and he had lost it 11 months ago in a study at midnight with a spreadsheet open. He had one clear thought as he listened to her hang up and come back to bed and settle beside him with the ease of a woman who believed she was 3 moves ahead. It was that she had never once, in 9 years, asked him what he actually did. At work in the spring, exactly as she had planned, they moved. Grant called a partnership meeting and presented, with great regret and considerable performance, a proposal to dissolve. Having, he explained, sadly, lost confidence in Owen's engagement with the business. Vivian filed the same week. It was coordinated to the day, and it was, Owen thought, watching it happen from a chair in a conference room, genuinely impressive work by two people who had never once considered that the man they were doing it to had modeled this exact scenario in the 4th month and had been waiting in it for 7. He did not fight. That was the part that unnerved them. Afterward, when they had time to think about it, he agreed to the dissolution. He agreed to the sale of the house. He was reasonable and quiet and pleasant, and he signed things. And 2 things happened in the following 11 days that neither of them saw coming. The first was that when Grant's lawyers came to inventory the firm's intellectual property, they discovered that the models were obsolete, that the working versions had been built outside firm hours on personal equipment, and that there was an 11-month time-stamped witness development record proving it, and that the clause protecting it was in the original agreement Grant himself had signed. The firm Grant had spent 2 years engineering his way into sole ownership of turned out to be a client list, a lease, and a set of software that no longer worked. The second was that on the 9th day, Helena Straub's group announced that it was moving its entire risk modeling relationship, the largest single account either man had ever touched, to a new independent consultancy founded by Owen Marsden, and that the transition had been finalized quietly 3 weeks earlier. Grant had not lost a partner. He had lost the business. And in the middle of the wreckage, Vivienne Marsden discovered that the balance sheet she had been dividing so carefully for 11 months had been describing a company that no longer existed, and that the mild man she had described to a laughing table as a savings account had, without raising his voice once, simply walked out of the frame she had built around him. It should have ended there. It did not, because Grant Whitlock had not just been positioning himself, he had been stealing, and Owen's sealed records were about to become the least survivable thing in his life. Because the discrepancies Owen had been quietly documenting for a year had never been about a wife's dishonesty. They had been about money. For 2 years, Grant had been moving client funds through the firm in a pattern that Owen, who could not look at anything without seeing how it failed, had recognized in the 4th month for exactly what it was, and had kept collecting patiently without ever letting on. And when the dissolution went wrong, and the models turned out to be worthless, and Helena Straub's account walked out of the door, Grant did the arithmetic that desperate men do, and arrived at the conclusion that the only remaining threat was a set of records in a study, and that the man who kept them was mild, unremarkable, and would never fight anything. He was wrong on the last point in a way that would take him the rest of his life to fully appreciate. The building went dark at 2:30. Owen was still there, on the 14th floor, in the small office of a consultancy 11 days old, because he had not been sleeping and had long ago stopped pretending he would. The power died, the lift stopped, and the emergency lighting came up in that low green that makes a familiar corridor look like somewhere else. And Owen Marsden, who spent his professional life calculating the probability of unlikely events, sat very still in the dark and thought, with complete clarity, that a building's power does not fail on the one night a man is alone in it with the only copies of something. He did not panic. He did not run. He thought, cold and clear, the way he always had. Somewhere below, a service door opened on the stairwell. And Owen did the thing that no one who had ever laughed at him would have predicted, which was that he had already done it. 11 days earlier, when he had signed the lease on that office, he had done what he always did with a new structure, which was to model how it would fail, and he had noted, without drama, that the building's server room was on the same circuit as the floor lighting, that the fire stairs were the only access above the 10th floor after hours, and that a man alone at night with valuable records in a building with a single point of entry was carrying a risk he could remove for almost nothing, So he had removed it. The originals had never been in that office at all. They were in a bank vault under his attorney's name, and had been since the day he signed the lease. What was in the office was a working copy, encrypted, and a laptop, and a very ordinary filing cabinet. And in the ceiling, void above his desk, because Owen Marsden could not help himself, was a small battery-powered camera that had been recording continuously for 11 days, because a man who has spent a year documenting a betrayal does not stop being that man simply because the betrayal is over. He heard the fire door on his floor. He picked up his phone, which had no signal because the repeater was on the failed circuit, and he walked, unhurried, into the server room where the wired emergency line ran on its own supply, and he made one call to a number Helena Straub had given him and told him to use if he ever needed it at any hour for anything. Then he went back to his desk, and he sat down, and he waited. Grant Whitlock came through the door with a torch and a bag, and stopped when he saw a man sitting calmly in the dark. "Christ," he said, "you are still here." "I'm always still here," Owen said. That was rather the point of me. And Grant, who had spent 9 years talking over this man at meetings, did the thing that men like Grant always do, which was to talk. He explained at length, and with feeling, that Owen had made this necessary, that he had been the one who built the business while Owen hid in the back, that the records were an act of aggression, that a man who documents his friends is not a friend, that all Owen had to do was hand over the cabinet, and this could still be civilized. He said, in the pleased tone of a man landing a point, that Vivienne had been right about him, that he was not a person so much as a filing system. And then he said the thing that would end him, which was, do you have any idea how easy you were? 2 years. 2 years, Owen, and you never noticed a thing? And Owen Marsden, sitting in the green emergency light in an office, 11 days old, said quietly, 4 months. Grant stopped. "I noticed in the 4th month," Owen said. "You started taking the client dinners in cash in the March, and you moved the reconciliations to a Friday, and you became very generous about my hours. I have every transfer. I have the falsified expenses. I have the Tuesday you told the Halloran account their premium had gone up when it had not." He did not raise his voice. He had never, in his adult life, raised his voice. "I have all of it, Grant, and it is not in this office, and it has not been in this office for 11 days. It is in a vault in my attorney's name, and a sealed copy went to the regulator's office by courier this afternoon. Before you did any of this, he let that sit. The only thing you will accomplish tonight is adding a felony to a case that was already closed. And the camera in the ceiling has been recording since you came through that door." The silence was enormous. Grant Whitlock stood in a dark office with a torch in one hand and understood, roughly 9 seconds too late, that he had walked into a room built for him. He lunged once at the cabinet, and Owen did not stop him because there was nothing in it. And then the stairwell door opened again, and the floor filled with people. Because Helena Straub had not sent security, she had sent her own head of corporate investigations and 2 members of the state fraud unit who had been reviewing the sealed files since 4 that afternoon. And the trap, Grant had spent 2 years building closed around him in an office he had broken into at 2:30 in the morning. While being filmed, time seemed to fracture. And afterward, when the floor was full of people and lights and voices, Helena Straub herself came out of the lift the moment the power returned, 71 years old, in a coat over nightclothes, and crossed that office and took Owen Marsden by both shoulders. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, and her voice, which had ended careers in single sentences, was not steady. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I am fine," Owen said. And then, because he was still himself, he added, he lunged at an empty filing cabinet. I did rather want to see if he would." And Helena Straub let out a short, disbelieving bark of laughter, and then, to the astonishment of everyone present, pulled the mild, unremarkable man into a fierce and entirely uncharacteristic embrace. "You extraordinary creature," she said into his shoulder. "They spent 2 years telling each other you were nothing, and you had the whole thing modelled in the 4th month." Grant Whitlock, the man who had spent 9 years talking over his partner in meetings, learned the price of underestimating him over the following 14 months, which is roughly how long the proceedings took. Owen did not testify with rage. He testified the way he did everything calmly, in order, with timestamps, and it was infinitely worse. He did not ask for the maximum. When it was suggested to him that he might push for it, he said mildly that he did not need to make a martyr of the man, he needed to make him nothing, and that the difference mattered, so they did it his way. Grant lost the firm, the license, the professional standing, and every asset that had been purchased with money that was not his, and emerged into a world where his name was a case study taught to trainees, permanently, as an example of what happens when a charming man assumes the quiet one is not paying attention. He was not destroyed. He was simply, comprehensively, known. The old men in that industry agreed it was far worse than a prison term alone would have been. As for Vivienne, she was not charged with anything because she had not done anything criminal. She had merely spent 11 months planning a future on the assumption that her husband was a fixed and predictable asset. She had told a table of laughing people that Owen had never taken a risk in his life, and she had built her entire exit on that being true, and it had never been true for a single day, and the discovery of that, more than the money, more than the house, was the thing she could not get past. She wrote to him once, some months afterward, a long letter that asked in 11 different ways. When he had known, he read it twice. He did not reply. And Corinne, who had said, "Can you imagine Owen doing something like that?" found the story of what he had actually done circulating through every social circle she cared about within a season, always with her line quoted at the beginning of it, and spent a long time explaining that she had only been joking. A year later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Owen Marsden stood at the window of a consultancy that now employed 19 people in the same 3 jackets, and did not explain himself to anyone anymore. He had bought a small house near the water, and he had started sleeping again, which he had not expected. Helena Straub came in without knocking, because she never knocked, and stood beside him with her coffee. "You are staring out of windows," she said. "It is unlike you." "I am estimating how long the ferry takes," Owen said. "I am considering being late for something." "Good God," said Helena. Then she was quiet a moment. "Do you know what I understood? That first day, when I came to see who had written that report," she said. "There were 9 people in that room, and 8 of them were performing for me, and one of them told me my 3rd largest subsidiary was going to fail." She looked at him. "Every person in your life mistook your calm for softness. It never once occurred to any of them that a man who is not afraid of bad news is the most dangerous person in any room, because he is the only one still doing arithmetic, while everybody else is panicking." She raised her cup slightly. "They spent 2 years planning around you, Owen. They should have spent an afternoon asking you a question." Owen Marsden looked out at the water, and for the first time in his adult life, did not feel the need to be smaller than he was. He had spent 41 years being described as mild, unremarkable, safe, a savings account, a filing system, and he had proven every last one of those descriptions wrong without ever raising his voice, because the thing the world had dismissed as timidity, the relentless, unglamorous habit of looking directly at how things fail, had saved his work. And his life. He had heard his wife through a wall at 2 in the morning, planning a future that did not include him. She never once suspected he had already been living in a different one for 11 months. And by the time the people who laughed at him understood what he actually was, he was not in the room anymore, and everything of value had quietly walked out with him. If Owen's story of hidden worth, cold patience and hard-won vindication moved you, if something in you steadied when the quiet man said 4 months, then do us a small favor before you go smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated is not the same as being weak, and that the person who says the least is very often the one paying the most attention. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything they deserve. And drop a comment below and tell us, what was your favorite moment in Owen's story?